audiences for 130 years. What is it about this character that has made him a worldwide phenomenon? Join Sherlockian expert Robert Fritsch.
Fritsch. I'm a son of a Fritsch.
I'll remember
So.
He's your guide tonight for all things Sherlock. You will learn about Sherlock Holmes' main characters, including Sherlock himself. Highlights of the 4 novels and 56 short stories will be briefly examined, but the emphasis will be on the women of Holmes' life. But the story of Sherlock is so much more than literary works, which have not been out of print since they were first published. You will take a tour of it all, including the movies, TV shows, actors, magazines, and these exist, Sherlockian societies. Who knew? This is a fun, fast-paced, interactive program, and audience participation is welcomed. Okay, but not too much. Vote for your favorite Sherlock actor, test your knowledge of Sherlock trivia, and more. And bring your questions. So all 45 of us or so, let's give a big round of applause to Bob.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to sit down because I can't stand for very long periods of time. Hopefully this microphone is just in the right position so you can all hear me. Okay, as Bob said, I'm Bob Fritsch. I'm from Nashua, New Hampshire, and I have been reading Sherlock Holmes since I was about 10 years old. So that's a very, very long time, but not in the history of Sherlock, of course. So, we are all welcome here. As he said, please cells to vibrate. I find airplane mode is the handiest thing because you can still receive stuff, but it's not going to make any noise to disturb us. Let's see, what else? With these cell phones, I like to say, set your phasers to stun, if you recognize that analogy there. Well, since we're on the subject of Star Trek and Star Wars, have you heard about the new Wookiee burgers? No? They're chewy. Okay, it's going to be that kind of day, so. This is an interactive program, so the more you put into it, the better enjoyment for all. If you have a comment during the presentations, please raise your hand, and I'll get to you at a convenient break in the narrative. There will be a few quizzes today. Some are easy, some not so easy. Some will call on your prior knowledge, some will be covered here, and some will depend on your powers of deduction and observation. Now, I'm a Navy veteran, 24 years worth, and I have been trained as a deck plate instructor. That's the guy who goes out to the ships. I'm not a formal instructor, just one of them passes my knowledge on. But one thing we did learn in instructor training is if there's something important in the narrative, if you hear that, pay attention, okay? Because you just may be seeing it again. Okay, here's an example. What is the significance of 221B? Anybody?
Address.
It's the address where he lived, of course. What street? Baker Street. Now, who's been to London? A few of us. Okay. Who's been to 221B Baker Street? Okay. It's a savings and loan. I forget what the actual title for the establishment is. The Brits call it something different. But on the second floor, they used to have a desk that would get all the letters addressed to Sherlock Holmes at 221B. And it's a huge pile of stuff. And somebody would actually answer, and they've since stopped that. But there is a very nice book called Letters to 221B by this establishment. You know, they publish all these letters that people had written into Sherlock Holmes. Okay, here's today's program. So in session 1, we're going to talk about the major players in the saga. We call it the canon. C-A-N-O-N, okay? Of course, this guy named Doyle, Dr. Watson, and Mr. Holmes. Then we'll take a short break. just to fill what's empty and empty what's full. And then we go into part B, which is the fun stuff, the books, movies, TV, and everything else. You can read all that stuff up there. I'm not going to go over it. Okay, so is everybody ready? Are we all comfortable? Well, that's good, because now the game is afoot. Written in the Sherlock Holmes saga, there's 56 short stories and 4 novels. We call it the canon. The canon. Sherlock Holmes, I'm a Nikon man myself, but okay, the Sherlock Holmes is the greatest man who never lived. I'm ahead of myself already. Anyway, created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, this character and his companion, Dr. John H. Watson, have endured the test of time. Doyle wrote 56 short stories and 4 novels detailing the exploits of the duo, casting Watson as Holmes's biographer. These stories have never been out of print since the first anthology was printed in 1892. Wow is right. And of course refer to it as the canon. Okay, who has read at least one Sherlock Holmes story? Okay, who has read all of them? A few. Who's read all of them many times? Okay, within the Sherlockian world, there are many, many societies that discuss, comment the whole works. A lot of them have a reading program, so we read one story a week or every 2 weeks, and then we exchange, on email, we have an email discussion. Okay, now we'll start with Arthur Conan Doyle, or ACD as we affectionately call him, and that's what I'll refer to him from here on out. Here's a little question. Why start with Doyle and not Holmes? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
No Doyle, would be no Holmes.
If there's no Doyle, there would be no Holmes. Very good. He's the creator, basically. Now, there's several excellent biographies about Doyle, and the 2 major sources were used for this segment. First is the most useful website, Sherlockian.net, hosted by Michigan State University, who took it over from Chris Redman of the Bootmakers of Toronto. Our societies take on all these names out of the canon, and we'll talk about these societies in the second part. Part B, actually. Therein is the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia, which contains a grunch of information. Yeah, that's the splash page for the Sherlockian.net. The second is, there's the encyclopedia right there. Okay, second is Conan Doyle, a biography by Pierre Nordin, it's an especially valuable reference because Nordin was one of the last biographers who actually had direct access to the Doyle's papers. Okay, the family has been extremely close about letting anybody see these things for many, many decades. It was written in French, and the English translation unfortunately left out many of the longer passages and the appendices, which means a lot of the information is still there in French, but for those who don't read French, well, too bad. It's an excellent work nonetheless. This is an ex-library book that I bought at a sale someplace, probably for a couple of bucks. If you try to buy it on the internet, it'll cost you a couple of $100. So keep your eyes open. Always have to be on the lookout. Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle was born in Picardy Place in Edinburgh on 22nd of May, 1859, to Charles Altamont Doyle and Mary Foley Doyle. He was the second of 7 children. His older sister, Annette Conan Doyle, and he were named after their father's uncle, Michael Conan, who had no children of his own, so his name was preserved with these two children of his brother. His mother was called the Ma'am, as you can see. You know, a lot of English and Scottish syntax is the dad or the da or the ma'am for mom, mother. She was a profound influence on his life. Now, he was sent to Jesuit school at the age of 9, then on to Stonyhurst College 2 years later. Well, there he wrote the Ma'am regularly, a tradition continuing to her death in 1920. This filled in many details of his life. One result of his Jesuit education was his total rejection of Christianity, becoming an agnostic and later a spiritualist. Guess they overdid it. Where in Edinburgh was ACD born? Picardy Place or Picardy Place, one of the two. Yep, absolutely right. You were listening. Excellent, thank you. Okay, after a brief interlude, he attended the University of Edinburgh to study for a medical degree in 1876. There he met two professors who would have a profound impact on his future. Professor Joseph Bell morphed into Sherlock Holmes, as Bell could read symptoms just by observing a patient. Professor William Rutherford was the prototype for ACD's favorite character, Professor George Edward Challenger. He wrote his first two published short stories here, The Mystery of Sasassa Valley and The American's Tale. To earn money for his family, he worked as a medical assistant, then as a doctor aboard a ship in Greenland. Okay, here's a quiz. Which one is he? Where is ACD in that picture? Any takers? Yeah, let me jump up here. Which one? This guy right here? Over? Him? Actually, let's put the arrow there. There he is. Okay. Now, don't forget, he was a young man when he did this. So he looks a lot different than his regular formal photographs. Okay. He married his first wife, Louisa Hawkins, in 1885. She bore him two children, Mary in 1889 and Kingsley in 1892. His first novel in 1886 did not get published until years later, but his second eventually sold for £25 and was published in 1887. Remember the name of that magazine. Unfortunately, Beaton's Christmas Annual paid Doyle £25 for the rights to the very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet. Okay? Later, the estate tried to get the rights from Beaton's. They kept it. Otherwise, the ACD estate has rights to every story. While he was building his family, he concentrated on historical novels like Micah Clarke in 1889, mainly due to the influence of his mother, who was an admirer of Walter Scott. Based on his success with that novel, he wrote The White Company in 1891, a story that compares to Ivanhoe. Who's read The White Company? Anybody? It's a wonderful novel. If you like Ivanhoe, you'll love The White Company. And there's a cast of thousands, just like Tolstoy. So, ACD once hailed a cab in Paris. Yeah, okay. ACD once hailed a cab in Paris. He threw his handbag inside, climbed in, but before he could say a word, the cabbie said, "Where to, Dr. Doyle?" "You recognize me?" said Doyle. "Not really, but I read in the paper that you're on vacation in the south of France. I saw you getting off the Marseille train and you have a tan that indicates a week in the sun. You're a writer from the ink spot on your fingers and the keen look of a medical man, and your clothes are English. Altogether, you surely must be the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Besides, your name is on your luggage." That's from Isaac Asimov's Treasury of Humor. Yeah, we got to have some shenanigans here, you know? Okay, in 1889, J.M. Stoddard of Lippincott's Magazine in the U.S. had dinner with Doyle and Oscar Wilde, hiring them to write 2 stories. Wilde's was The Picture of Dorian Gray, and ACD wrote The Sign of the Four. Now you notice here it says The Sign of the Four. It's also known as The Sign of Four. Now they dropped the second the. I don't know why. Later editions of the novel dropped the second the. The meeting resulted in a cordial but distant friendship between the 2 authors. Most of you know about Wilde's problems and everything, so I won't go into those. The Doyles went to Vienna for a few months for more medical training and took up residence in Montague Place upon return to London. No patience meant more writing. Aha. Enter the Strand magazine, first published in January of 1891. Publisher George Nunes was looking for an anchor series, and ACD provided it. With Scandal in Bohemia, published in Volume 1, Number 7, July 1891. The magazine's covers got gaudier over the years, as you can see, but the basic picture never changed. So you still see the spire of the church and the building and all that sort of stuff. And of course, they really pumped up Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes at the same time. Obviously, the Strand was ACD's favorite outlet, as you can see here. That was his output just for the Strand magazine. Okay? That's a lot of writing. The first 6 stories were published in that year, then contracted for an additional 6. He was ready to kill Holmes so he could concentrate on his more serious work, but the man persuaded him not to, even providing some plot outlines. ACD finally pulled the plug, throwing Holmes over Reichenbach Falls in December of 1893 issue. We'll talk more about the stories in Part B. And we can see here, this is from Punch magazine, which is a British humor magazine, a lot of kind of political humor type stuff. But you can see that he's shackled to Sherlock Holmes, which he really didn't care for. Okay, let's test your powers of observation here. What was the name of the magazine that published A Study in Scarlet? Beaton's Christmas Annual, absolutely right. Okay, on we go. After Sherlock was off his back, ACD made a lecture tour in the U.S. in 1894 and started to build a house in Surrey in the spring of 1895. He and Louisa traveled to Egypt during construction, and he got the idea for more stories from the conflicts he observed there. Now, the Boer War broke out in 1899, and ACD volunteered in the local regiment only to be placed on hold. A friend persuaded him to run a field hospital in Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State, which he did for 6 months in 1900. On his return, he ran for Member of Parliament in Edinburgh, but was defeated. He never did get elected despite 2 tries. Okay? You notice I always say Edinburgh. I lived in Scotland for 2.5 years with the Navy, so that was a great tour, I'll tell you what. They had to escort me out of the country under armed guard. In the fake news of the day, Britain was accused of all sorts of human rights abuses against the Boers. ACD wrote 2 books essentially saying nonsense, which earned him the honor of Knight Bachelor. So he got his knighthood from these books right here, the Great Boer War and the War of South Africa, that's case and conduct, instead of not Sherlock Holmes, which is pretty cool, actually. He was known as Sir Arthur after that, of course. Holmes made an appearance in Strand magazine with the serialized Hound of the Baskervilles in 1901 and 1902, and he was resurrected from the dead in 1903. Now, these are actually publication dates in the magazine, not the story dates. Okay? His wife Louisa died in 1906, and this put him into a deep depression. He had met and fallen in love with Jean Leckie, this is Dame Jean, in 1897, a full 9 years before his wife died. They said it was a platonic relationship until after Louisa's death. Okay. He married Jean a year later in 1907, and she bore him 3 children at their estate in Crowborough. Here we go. He created his favorite character in 1912, Professor George Edward Challenger, with the novel The Lost World. Who's read The Lost World? Not the Michael Crichton one in Jurassic Park series, but The Lost World. Or seen one of the movies. There have been several movies about it too. Okay. It was followed by 2 more books and 2 short stories. Michael Crichton named the second Jurassic Park in homage to Challenger and Doyle. Now here's the initial description of Challenger by Edward Malone, the narrator of the books, or in other words, Challenger's Watson. His appearance made me gasp. I was prepared for something strange, but not for so overpowering a personality as this. It was his size which took one's breath away. His size and his imposing presence. His head was enormous, the largest I have ever seen upon a human being. I am sure that his top hat, had I ventured to don it, would have slipped over me entirely and rested on my shoulders. He had the face and beard which I associate with an Assyrian bull, the former florid, the latter so black as to be almost have a suspicion of blue, spade-shaped and rippling down over his chest. The hair was peculiar, plastered down in front with a long curving wisp over his massive forehead. The eyes were blue-gray under great black tufts, very clear, very critical, and very masterful. A huge spread of shoulders and a chest like a barrel were the other parts of him which appeared above the table, save for 2 enormous hands covered in long black hair. This and a bellowing, roaring, rumbling voice made up my first impression of the notorious Professor Challenger. Now this picture is the first person to portray Challenger. Who is it? Oops. Let's go back. That's Conan Doyle himself, playing Challenger. Yeah. Also, have you ever heard of the Piltdown Man, the missing link? No? Okay. Supposedly it was the skull of a Neanderthal or something with the jaw of an ape. You know, so it was the missing link between the ape and the humans and everything, but it was a hoax. And they think that Conan Doyle was one of the perpetrators. And the thing was discovered in 1912, and it took 41 years to say, nah, that ain't right. ACD volunteered to serve in World War I, but was not permitted to go to the front. So he wrote a Why We Fight pamphlet and wrote the history of the war day by day, which was published in 1920 as the British campaign in France and Flanders in 6 volumes. His son Kingsley and his brother Innes died as a result of war wounds complicated by pneumonia. And this kind of sent him into depression also. The rest of his life was dedicated to spiritualism, which he had embraced since the late 1880s. He made several international tours speaking about the subject. He was friends with Harry Houdini for a time. He believed in fairies and had photographic evidence to back it up. You can see right there. Exhausted from his journeys, he fell sick and died of a heart attack on 7 July 1930. The last words to his wife were, "You are wonderful." So ended the life of a fascinating and complex man. He was originally buried in the Rose Garden of Winstead, his home, because he was not a Christian. Could not be buried in a Christian churchyard. He was later reinterred with his wife in the churchyard at Minstead in New Forest, Hampshire. So I'm sure there was a little bit of compensation there. What was ACD's full name?
Sherlock Conan Doyle. Sir Ed Conan Doyle.
Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, right. Okay, we spent a lot of time on Doyle because he will not be prominent during the rest of this session, or rest of our talk. This is the point where the great game kicks in, or the grand game. Holmes and Watson are historical, not fictional characters, and Watson's chronicles are of actual events. That's the great game. ACD was the literary agent who sometimes edited Watson's work, not doing a very good job at it. Here are the short biographies of our two protagonists based on the book Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street by William S. Baring Gould. Bear in mind there are several different timelines of the adventures, but we're sticking with BG's. His annotated was a seminal work where he ordered the stories according to his own timeline. Excuse me. I saw that 2-volume set in London in 1979 for 60 quid. But had no way of transporting it at the time, which is fortunate because when I went back to the States, the same set sold for $60, and the pound was $2.10. So saved half the price there. Okay, if you were to ask the question, who is the most important character in the canon, most would answer Sherlock Holmes. I beg to differ that opinion, because I think the most important character in the canon is Watson. Without him, we would not know of Holmes. Just as Samuel Johnson had his Bosworth, so Holmes had his Watson. He serves another very important function. He is the bridge between the reader and Holmes. So here you have this genius, remote, antisocial pretty much. And then you have Watson. So the reader can identify with Watson and jump right into the stories. What if Watson the man? John Hamish Watson was born on 7 August 1852 to Henry Watson and Ella Mackenzie. I don't need to tell you what is on the screen since you can read it yourself. There we go, his early life. Now you notice back here I did not give a date of death, because his death has never been reported in the London Times, and such an important person must have an obituary when he passes on, right? So he never died. Right now, 1852, 170 years almost. Okay, so go ahead and read that stuff. I don't like putting words on the screen in PowerPoint because if you're reading, you're not listening type thing, you know. But there's Watson's biography according to Baring Gould. Okay, here's a shot of St. Bart's where he did part of his training. Now Holmes also was at St. Bart's, so they may have crossed paths in the hospital without knowing it. He was attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers as an assistant surgeon and sailed for India with a regiment where he served for 2 years. He was transferred to the Berkshires, the 66th Foot, in 1880, just in time for the Battle of Maiwand in the Second Afghan War, where he was wounded by a Giselle bullet. These things are really nasty. In the shoulder, but maybe the leg, on 27 July 1880. His orderly Murray got him back behind British lines, where he spent a long recovery in a variety of hospitals. November of 1880 found him back in London, where he spent his meager funds to get established. In January of 1881, he met young Stamford at the Criterion Bar and mentioned that he was looking for digs. Stamford introduced him to Sherlock Holmes, and they moved into 221B Baker Street, an address that did not exist in the Victorian era. Baker Street was blocked off at about number 47. That's where it ended. After a few adventures together, Watson moved to San Francisco and bought a practice. Here he met Miss Constance Adams, fell in love, and they were married in November of 1886. The Watsons returned to England and he bought a practice in Kensington and resumed his adventures with Holmes. Unfortunately, Constance died of diphtheria just after the adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, December of 1887, so Watson returned to Baker Street. After several more adventures with Holmes, he met Miss Mary Morstan during the Sign of Four. He married her on May 1st, 1889. He bought a practice in Paddington, but Mary encouraged him to continue his relation with Holmes, and then struck the day of tragedy, 4th of May, 1891, when Holmes and Professor Moriarty plunged over Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. Watson returned to a practice that allowed him plenty of time for writing, but tragedy again struck in late 1891 or early 1892 when Mary died of heart trouble. The only time Watson fainted was on 5 April 1894, 3 years later, when Holmes returned from the dead. It was back to Baker Street for both of them until July 1902. Yep, it was the third Mrs. Watson that separated them again. They took rooms in Queen Anne Street and built a thriving practice. Unfortunately, she wanted him to stay at home. But of course, Sherlock still called him frequently, and he always went. Their final case together was his last bow, 2 August 1914. What is significant about that date? Anybody? World War I. It was the eve of World War I, actually. I think it started actually formally on the 4th of August. There's no record of Watson's death, so of course he's still waiting for the next call from his best friend and companion. Mares, I forgot to knock when I said that. Where was Watson's war wound? Shoulder or leg, yeah. And the Sherlockians actually have a lot of fun with that, you know, because it hit his shoulder and then bounced around and went down and popped out his leg or something like that. You know, it's kind of nutsy, but it's a lot of fun at the same time. Okay. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson went on a camping trip. After a good meal and a bottle of wine, they lay down for the night and went to sleep. Some hours later, Holmes woke and nudged his faithful friend. "Watson, look up at the sky and tell me what you see." Watson replied, "Well, I see millions and millions of stars." "What else does that tell you?" Watson pondered for a minute. "Well, astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observe that Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I deduce the time is approximately 3:15. Theologically, I can see that God is all-powerful and that we are small and insignificant. Meteorologically, I suspect that we will have a beautiful day tomorrow. What does it tell you?" Holmes said, "Watson, you see but you did not observe. Somebody stole the tent." William Sherlock Scott Holmes was born on the 6th of January, 1854, to Siger Holmes and Violet Sharonford at the family homestead Mycroft in North Riding, Yorkshire. He had 2 older brothers. Sharonford is named for his mother, and Mycroft named after their farm. A croft is a farm, so it's Mycroft, my farm. The family lived in France 1855 to 1864, with brief interludes in England. Sherlock and Mycroft were sent to boarding school in England, while Sharonford, who would inherit the estate under British rules, always the firstborn son inherits the estate, the other sons had to go to war or, you know, find their own way in the world. Severe illness hit Sherlock in 1865-66, and upon recovery, he resumed his day studies. It was back to France, 1868 to 1871, where Sherlock learned fencing. Back to England, he was tutored briefly by Professor James Moriarty, but they despised one another, and that gig was over pretty quick. His father wanted him to be an engineer, so he enrolled in mathematics at Oxford in 1872, making friends with Charles Dodson. Who's Charles Dodson? Charles Dodgson, D-O-D-G-S-O-N. You also know him as Lewis Carroll, writer of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. His first recorded case was here, the Glorious Scott, which changed the course of his life. He dropped out a decision that caused his father to disown him, giving him a reasonable allowance and never seeing him again. You know, well, hey, the Brits were pretty strict about that, especially the gentry. Then it was on to Cambridge, where his methods were talked about all over the school and cemented his determination to become the world's first consulting detective. He never did get a degree. By the end of his studies in Camford, or was it Oxbridge, one of the two, Holmes took rooms on Montague Street. Now, it's funny that Doyle lived on Montague Street for a while also, just around the corner from the British Museum. Where am I here? That's the reading room in the British Museum. He spent countless hours studying the annals of crime for his new profession, reading the agony columns in the newspapers, and meeting people from all walks of life, like the anarchists, to study their habits, methods, and culture. Did he meet Karl Marx here? Because Karl Marx was studying in the British Museum reading room about the same time. He also studied organic chemistry at Bart's, where he may have passed Watson in the hallways as they were both there at the same time. He incessantly wandered about around London, becoming intimately familiar with its highways and byways and the people he met along the way. His most treasured possession was found during these wanderings, a Stradivarius he found in a pawn shop in Tottenham Court Road, which he bought for 55 shillings. Now, to put that in context, 20 shillings, 20 shillings per pound, so 55 shillings was almost 3 pounds. Okay, a Stradivarius, you can't touch one for less than, what, 100,000, 500,000? Something like that. They were expensive back then, but I guess the pawnbroker didn't know what he had. Okay, where was I? He was an amateur boxer, learning his skill in college, doing well in the ring. He also began writing several monographs. What's a monograph? We call it a magazine article. On subjects like tobacco ash ciphers, footprints, and the dating of documents, many of which Watson reports in the canon. He took occasional cases during this time, including the Musgrave Ritual, which helped build his reputation. Running low on funds, he gravitated towards the theater, using the stage name William Escott, where he played a variety of roles while learning everything he could about the theater and the art of disguise, because he was a master at it. On tour in the U.S., he was the first exposed to the American gangster culture and assisted the police in a few cities with their cases. He returned to England in 1880 with a healthy bankroll and was soon back at his studies in the British Museum and at Bart's. It was at the latter where he met Watson in 1881. Okay, here's a quiz. How did he get a stage name?
His own name. His real name.
His real name, almost, right. William S. Scott Holmes. So William Escott. There we go. He took rooms at 221B Baker Street and settled into a comfortable existence. Here we get a glimpse of the main room with the chemistry labs on the left and right, the tobacco in the Persian slipper, cigars in the coal scuttle, and the typical over-furnished room of the Victorian era. You see that Persian slipper there? It's up on the mantelpiece, I think. Yeah, over on the left side of the mantel, just above the hearth, you know, on the second level down.
Was it cocaine?
Huh?
Was it cocaine?
That was in his chemistry set. Okay. The years between 1881 and 1891 were well documented by Watson, and we will not linger on them here. We met his brother Mycroft, who is the British government and lives at the Diogenes Club, where talking is forbidden. Needless to say, he kept his eye on his old tutor, Professor Moriarty, while gathering a case against him and his organization. Matters came to a head in 1891 when the case was nearly complete, that attacks on Holmes were increasing, and he decided to vacate London with Watson, even disguising himself as an Italian priest, and tour the continent. It was in the Swiss village of Meiringen that he made that fateful trek to Reichenbach Falls, where he and Moriarty met, grappled, and plunged into the abyss. When Watson delivered the news to the public, there was widespread disbelief. People went about with black armbands, and the entire nation went into mourning, except for one person. The next 3 years are known as the Great Hiatus. Only Moriarty died at Reichenbach, but Holmes still feared for his life, fleeing from Colonel Sebastian Moran, Moriarty's lieutenant, and the second most dangerous man in London. He first went to Florence, then to Montenegro, where he met up with Irene Adler, the woman, and lingered there with her for several months. Pregnant, Irene returned to the U.S. and gave birth to a boy who grew up to be another famous detective who displayed Mycroft's appearance and traits more than Sherlock's, rarely leaving his brownstone on West 35th Street. Who is he? Anybody? Nero Wolfe. So the legend is Nero Wolfe is the bastard child of Sherlock Holmes. Okay. In his own words, in The Empty House, I traveled for 2 years in Tibet. Therefore, I amused myself by visiting Lhasa and spending some days with the head lama. You may have read the remarkable explorations of a Norwegian named Sigurdsson. His father's name was Sigurd, so he was Sigurd's son. That's where a lot of these son names come from. And I'm sure it never occurred to you that you were receiving news of your friend. I then passed through Persia, looked in at Mecca, and paid a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum, the results of which I have communicated to the Foreign Office, meaning his brother Mycroft. Returning to France, I spent some months in a research into the coal tar derivatives, which I conducted in a laboratory at Montpellier in the south of France. Did anybody watch Elementary last Thursday? Yeah? There were a lot of these things in there. We call them Easter eggs, directly from the canon. Holmes came back a changed man. It is unsure if he converted or merely followed the teachings, but you can see by this chart he did change. Never again did he use drugs. His alcohol intake moderate before became almost non-existent. He treated Watson with greater deference, if not respect, and showed his true feelings when Watson got shot in the adventure of the Three Garridebs. His interests, always broad, focused on the crime and his profession, but after that, it was anything goes. In the Bruce Partington plans, he studied the polyphonic motets of Lassus, whoever the hell he is, for which he wrote a monograph, said by experts to be the last word on the subject. Now, as an aside, this score I found in a bookstore in San Diego for $3. You know, now I have no interest in the symphonic motets of Lassus, but I had to have it because it's got the Sherlockian connection. Again, if you know your stuff, be on the lookout for it. You never know where it's going to pop. Watson was busy with his third wife by this time and was only an occasional tenant of Baker Street. Their busiest year was 1895, and they had many wonderful adventures together. In late 1903, Holmes vacated the premises and moved to Sussex Downs to pursue beekeeping and his studies. He was briefly pulled out of retirement prior to World War I to head a spy ring against the Germans. His last spy was the final chronological case with Watson. There were occasional cases, but mostly he studied his bees and subsisted on royal jelly. He wrote 2 seminal works during his retirement: The Practical Handbook of Bee Culture with some observations upon the segregation of the queen, and The Whole Art of Detection. I'm still looking for that book. We know he's still with us because the London Times never reported his death. Let's take a short break. Be back at 8 o'clock, please. So our first session was kind of the serious part of the whole thing. Part B here is the fun stuff. Okay, so here's what we're going to be talking about in the next 35 minutes. So we're going to blow right through this thing as fast as we can. What is thumping around here? Don't know. Okay, so let's talk about books for a while, and I'm going to be jumping around the subject. Okay, how many short stories and how many novels? Okay, no, that's for Holmes, okay? So, 4 novels, 58 short stories, right? 56. Yeah. So, our literary agent tried to write a couple of stories on his own. What the heck is thumping around here? Anyway, one is How Watson Learned the Trick in 1924, and the other is The Field Bazaar in 1896. Both are shorts, and neither is very good. We believe both have Watson attempting to deduce stuff and getting miserably bad. There's also 4 unofficial writings. One of them does not specifically mention Holmes. There are 3 of them, the first 3 right there. But there's an investigator who sounds an awful lot like him. The last one is a stage play that ran for 28 performances in 1921. The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone was based on this play and was published shortly thereafter. What was the first Sherlock Holmes story? Study in Scarlet. What magazine? Beaton's Christmas Annual. Thank you very much. And it was underwhelming success initially, but once this Holmes phenomenon took off, watch out. Now, most of the stories begin with the adventure of the, which can be quite cumbersome. I think I'm, exploding into the microphone here. That's what the pop is. Okay, so a noted Sherlockian scholar named J. Finley Christ developed a shorthand that is in universal use. It's simple. Take the first 4 letters of the title, for the most part. You can see that there are some exceptions, but it works. So if I talk about Solly, for example, everybody knows it is the adventure of the solitary cyclist, S-O-L-I. Of course, there are exceptions, like 3 Gab, the adventure of the 3 Gables. 3 Stu, the adventure of the 3 students. Chaz, the adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. So on and so forth. As noted earlier, the second novel was The Sign of 4, when Watson started pumping short stories into the Strand magazine in 1891. The first 6 were met with resounding success, and then 6 and then 12 more. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes was released in a bound volume in 1892, followed by the Memoirs in 1893. They've never been out of print since then. Never. In Sign, we see that Watson met his second wife, Mary Morstan. And in A Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes met Irene Adler, the woman. Of course, she gets the better of him, which fuels his admiration. George Newnes needed an illustrator for these stories, so he set his sights on Walter Paget. But the letter was addressed to Mr. Paget, so his brother Sidney, also an illustrator, opened the letter, responded, and got the job. Sidney based his depiction of Holmes on his brother, and you can see the resemblance there. Zillions of fans know Holmes through the drawings signed SP, and watch some of the drawings coming up. You'll see it down there in the corner. Watson often referred to cases that could not be chronicled or were too dreadful for the public. He kept all these manuscripts in a battered tin dispatch box in the vaults of Cox and Company of Charing Cross. Now, J. Finley Christ wrote a poem. It's too long to get into here, but many of the obscure cases, which we Sherlockians love to try to exploit and write stories about and all that sort of stuff. My friend Jim Duvall was also known as the battered tin dispatch box. He was Sherlockian up in New Hampshire, founded the Cox and Company of New England. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 42, way too early. Now, Holmes had a very strange sense of justice, which the Victorians ate up. They always looked for justice, not the law. On occasion, he'd let the pert go, as in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. See the SP in the corner? Down the lower right. At other times, causing injury or even death, as in The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. He lost a few clients by sending them into danger, like John Openshaw in The Five Orange Pips, or Hilton Cubbott in The Dancing Men, who tried to defend his wife from her past. The Adventure of the Dancing Men, of course, is where he breaks a cipher. A cipher, Elsie, prepare to meet thy God. That's from the Dancing Men. And of course it was meant to be, oh, it's just child's drawing, you know, but it's actually a message. Okay. There's a story called The Adventure of Silver Blaze, where a star racehorse is missing. Okay, so Holmes has to go find him. Okay, one of the things he says, now these are only for people who are familiar with the story. Yeah, he was telling the police inspector, pay attention to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. What was that curious incident? Does anybody remember? No, the dog did nothing during the nighttime. And why? Because the dog knew who the perpetrator was. Can't fool a dog, can you? Now, Holmes's conduct during Silver Blaze should have landed him in a deep, dank dungeon. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of horse racing and all that sort of stuff, but it's very tightly controlled. Okay, so he finds the horse, but he doesn't tell anybody. Then he tells the owner to keep the horse in the race, but keeps the horse in a disguise that the person who found it put it in. And finally, he lays down a huge bet for himself when the odds are astronomical. Now, should that have landed him in jail? In the United States, it sure would have. Okay, so we all know that Silver Blaze is a horse. He goes into his bar, and the bartender says, "Hey, why the long face?" And then his son, the pony, comes in. "I'd like a beer, please." "What's wrong, laryngitis?" "No, I'm just a little horse." Now, there's several Violets in the canon, 4 to be exact. There is Violet Hunter in The Copper Beeches, Violet Smith in The Solitary Cyclist, Violet Westbury in The Bruce Partington Plans, and Violet de Merville in The Illustrated Client. Maybe because his mother was also named Violet, that Holmes looked upon these ladies with a bit of equanimity. Otherwise, he was a confirmed misogynist. Everyone has a top something list, and here there are several for the canon. The Baker Street Journal conducted several polls over the years with varying results. Now here are the ones chosen by the literary agent. Top one is The Speckled Band, followed by The Red-Headed League, the Dancing Men, Final Problem, Scandal in Bohemia, The Adventure of the Empty House, Five Orange Pips, The Second Stain, The Devil's Foot, Priory Lodge, Musgrave Ritual, and The Reigate Squires. Okay, and that's ACD's choices. Without a doubt, the most famous Holmes story is The Hound of the Baskervilles, Yo Hound. Not only was this the first Sherlock Holmes book to hit the bestseller list, it was the first detective novel to do so. The story is based on a West Country legend of a demonic hound, which literary agents suggested to Watson to recount the tale of his deceased friend. This is during the time that Holmes was missing. He was he'd gone over the falls, so everybody knew he was dead, but this was a pre-death thing. It was first published in 9 installments in the Strand magazine, August 1901 to April 1902. If you want a copy of these 2 bound volumes, they'll run $500 to $800 depending on their condition. It was only a few months before the first bound volume of the novel was published. If you want a copy of the first edition, this one's pretty raggedy. It'd fork over $700 to $1,800. Or you can get the specially bound version in leather, and that's the latest price I have on that is $3,000. No thanks. Now, just a quick note about pastiches and parodies. What's a pastiche? Okay, a pastiche is a story written using somebody else's characters. Okay, so Star Trek. There's zillions of Star Trek books out there, but they're pastiches. Same with Star Wars, you name it, any popular series has a lot of pastiches. So, of course, Holmes does also. Back in the 70s, this guy named Ronald DeWall wrote a bibliography that contained over 6,000 entries. Later writings by this author in the 90s have resulted in over 25,000 listings. And the list keeps growing. Of course, I already explained what a pastiche was. And then there is some of my favorite pastiches are Solar Ponds by August Derleth, later Basil Copper upon Derleth's death. The stories have a remarkable resemblance to another London detective who also wore an Inverness cape and a deerstalker hat. Who's read Laurie R. King, Mary Russell? Anybody? Okay. I'm not a fan, but it's a very popular series where Mary Russell marries Holmes and takes care of him in his old age. Then we get into parodies where they're poking fun at the at the character. This is one of my favorite, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes with Dr. Watney. This is by Robert L. Fish. Unfortunately, he died way too young, but he did leave an endowment. An award named after him is the best first short story by an American author published. So first mystery short story, you have to say. Another one of my favorite parodies of all times is Mad Magazine. Okay, they both had Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Basketballs. Any of you guys have any favorites? Okay, we'll just keep on going then. Over 75 actors, 254 plus productions. Now here's some of the people who have played Holmes. Yeah, heard any of them? No. We'll talk about some more, but I didn't have any idea these people even existed before I started doing this research. Oops, okay. The earliest dramatic depictions of Holmes were on the stage. Actually, once I was told to be on the stage, it left at noon. Okay, so there we go, the stage. Although not the first, the earliest famous actor on the stage was William Gillette, who Sherlock Holmes played for decades around the world. The play was originally written by Doyle, but it was so bad that Gillette was given the rewrite and the lead. Gillette once inquired, "May I marry Holmes?" To which Conan Doyle replied, "You may marry him, murder him, or do anything you like to him." It made him a rich man, and he built a castle overlooking the Connecticut River in Hadlime, Connecticut. It's a state park, and it's open to the public now. And if you've never been down there, you've been. Okay, great. How do you like it? Great, yeah. The main room is built in such a way, there's a balcony, and there's one certain spot in the balcony where Gillette used to stand. It could hear everybody in that room, what they were talking about. But it's made out of native stone. You got to go down there. It's south of Hartford on the Connecticut River. It's really great. Okay, Frank Langella revived Gillette's play in the late 70s and even presented it on HBO. Okay. Fritz Weaver, remember him from the 70s, Quinn Martin Productions and Streets of, yeah, anyway, he was a great character actor. He was in the musical Baker Street, which ran for 311 performances in the mid-60s. It was nominated for 4 Tonys and won one for set design. Also pictured on the playbill are Martin Gable, husband to Arlene Francis, as Professor Moriarty, and Inga Svensson as Irene Adler. Ron Moody started another musical Holmes production in the late 1980s. He's known as the man who turned down Doctor Who. Bad choice. Now there's some surprising names on this list also. We got Leonard Nimoy, Charlton Heston, Tom Baker, who did accept Doctor Who. He was one of my favorite Doctor Who's. But we best know Holmes through the silver screen and the tube. Now we're going to do a survey, and I'm going to take down numbers. Who is your favorite Holmes actor? You can vote more than once, and if you would help me count the responses. You want to do that? Okay. Okay, here we go. Number 1, who's your favorite Holmes? How about this guy, Basil Rathbone? Okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, about 11? Okay, come on, pen. I must have dropped it or something. Ah, there we go. Yeah, technology, ain't it wonderful? Okay, next guy. How about him? That's Peter Cushing, who you may recognize from Star Wars. He was the Death Star commander. He also played in a lot of horror flicks. You know, anybody like Peter Cushing? Okay, we'll put down 0 here. How about this guy? This is Ronald Howard. His father was Leslie Howard, who played Ashley in Gone with the Wind. Of course, Leslie Howard died during World War II, but Ronald Howard was on the tube in the 50s. Okay, I think he did 39 or 40 productions. You know, they were fun, but they were pretty lousy also. Who likes Ronald Howard? Anybody? Okay. 1. Okay, we got 1 here. Next guy. How about this one? Christopher Lee, another horror movie guy. He played Sherlock Holmes in a couple of flicks. Anybody? No, okay. Where's Christopher? There he is. How about this guy, Jeremy Brett, PBS. I got 1, 2, 3. Anybody? Jeremy Brett, PBS, okay, 3. Robert Downey Jr. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. 7. Okay. Personally, I did not like it. There's too much chop sake in that movie. You know, kung fu, and, you know, martial arts and all that sort of stuff. This guy. Johnny, oh yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. Him, Benedict Cumberbatch. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Anybody else? 12. Okay, only a couple more. Maybe just one more. How about this guy? That's good old Steed from the Avengers, Patrick McNee. Okay, anybody? No, okay. So, there we have Sherlock Holmes. Benedict is the winner. Johnny Lee is second place, I think. Yep. Okay, here we go with Watson. Who's your favorite Watson? H. Marion Crawford. He was Ronald Howard's Watson on the tube in the 50s. 0. David Burke. First Watson for Jeremy Brett. 1. Just 1? I'm going to count myself. We'll say 2. Patrick McNee. Now this is interesting because Patrick McNee is one of the very, very few people to portray both Holmes and Watson in separate flicks. So that's a 0. Edward Hardwicke, son of Sir Cedric Hardwicke. Jeremy Brett's second Watson. I got 1, 2, 3, okay. Next, Jude Law for Robert Downey Jr. 1, 2, 3, 3. Lucy Liu to Johnny Lee Miller. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Martin Freeman to Benedict. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12? Okay. Bubus Britannicus himself. Nigel Bruce to Basil Rathbone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11? Okay. Unfortunately, Bruce's depiction of Watson was just he was a total idiot. And we know that Watson was not an idiot because he wrote the stories. Yeah, right? So it took many, many years before an intelligent portrayal of Watson came along in the form of David Burke and Edward Hardwicke. Otherwise, it was just sort of more of the same. So the winner there is Martin Freeman. So the Cumberbatch-Freeman duo is the winner. Of course, we have to scrape the bottom of the barrel here to come up with the worst performances. And this is my hall of shame right here. The worst Holmes, Roger Moore. I mean, there wasn't a piece of scenery left unchewed by the time he was done. Tom Baker, horrible. And Matthew Frewer. He's the guy who played Max Headroom, and he was also on that Doctor show. You know, the nutsy surgeon and everything. But it was, yeah. You know. Okay. Here we go to the radio. Now this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. If you want to take a picture of this screen, that website right there has about 30 or 40 of these old Rathbone, Nigel Bruce radio shows. Okay, there were over 200 of those radio shows over the years in the 1940s. But this is a good place to go if you want to listen to those. Okay. Many of these programs were written by a guy named Anthony Boucher. And there's a big mystery convention every year called the BoucherCon. He was the critic for the New York Times. So I think it was New York Times, and Dennis Green also. Now, most of the scripts were based on the unwritten stories and were broadcast 39 to 46. In each, the narrator asked Dr. Watson, who's Nigel Bruce, for a story. I must say that Bruce is a much better Watson in the radio than he was on screen. You can find all sorts of audios on eBay and other sites. Here to name a few, and here are a few. The one in the upper center is a complete set of the Beebs, BBC, 1991 radio series starring Clive Merrison as Holmes. It faithfully adapted all 60 canonical adventures and is quite pricey. Others can be had for modest sums on eBay and Amazon for hours of listening pleasure. How many people still have their cassette players? Cassettes? Okay. Up here I have 3 Sherlock Holmes cassettes. The first 3 up there, to grab them, they're yours. Okay, but only 1 per customer, please. You know, I've already recorded them off. I think one of them, in fact, is still sealed because I had 2 of them. Okay, but records, CDs, the whole works. They're all out there. Okay, now Holmes had 3 dressing gowns that are blue, purple, and mouse colored. What color is mouse? Okay, gray's a good guess. I always thought it was gray too, but it's actually a brown mouse. Okay. This guy, Christopher Morley, was the inventor of the 3 hours for lunch club, which meant anywhere, unlike the Algonquin Round Table, which is always at the Algonquin Hotel in New York, and was dissolved after every meeting, then reformed for the next get-together. Morley was famous for creating clubs, but the one that endured most was the Baker Street Irregulars. He wrote the introduction to the complete Sherlock Holmes, published by Doubleday, and that was my first copy of the canon back in the 1960s. The only downside to that book, there were no illustrations. Now, the Baker Street Irregulars are the leading Sherlockian society in the U.S. Little spider just crawled across there. Their journal is called, amazingly enough, the Baker Street Journal. Their purpose is to keep the memory of the master green, where it is always 1895, which is Holmes's busiest year. They meet every January in New York City for a week of fun and shenanigans. The actual meeting is by invitation only. I have not gotten one yet. And you must be invited to be invested into the society, where you take on a canonical name. Non-BSI people can participate also with separate banquets and can join in the outside activities. Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine has at least one Holmes story in its January-February issue, which hits in the stands in time for BSI week. Now, I'm a member of 4 different Sherlockian societies. If you saw the original splash page, I'm a founding member of the 4th Garadeb. Nathan Garadeb was the only coin collector in the canon, as I am. And we found a bunch of us coin collectors went and founded the 4th Garadeb. You know, the adventures of the 3 Garadebs, you know. Why does BSI meet in January? Because he was born in January. Sherlockian societies abound. Most of them scion societies of the BSI. In other words, sanctioned. They're officially sanctioned. You can see that there are a lot of them. But the number is way down from the time I got involved 25 years ago. There used to be 666 active societies. So it's drawing back somewhat. But still, there are many puns on canonical titles or phrases, like the Sons of Copper Beaches in Philadelphia, or direct references like the Speckled Band of Boston. We also call them the Snakes. You can see my investor certificate to the Science Society of the 4th Garadeb. No, I didn't bring it. So they create logos, they write books, magazines, pins, all sorts of wonderful things. Now, there's an incredible amount of Sherlock material out there. Here's an eBay search on the simple phrase Sherlock Holmes. Look at the response. Hamilton Bookseller, the remainder people, currently offer 125 items. And if you're not familiar with Hamilton Books and you like books, go up on their website. They have thousands and thousands of books that people didn't buy, the remainders, and it costs $4 to ship as many books as you order. If you send them a check. If you pay by credit card, then you pay a lot for shipping. But send a check and boom, you know, they're down in Connecticut. Okay, here's a single page of 21 pages on Sherlocktron's list of purveyors. And these are people who sell Sherlockian type material. Look at that number there. A lot of it. We're almost done. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Who collects the royalties now? It's still going.
Who collects the royalties? The ACD estate, the Conan Doyle estate. Now, copyright expires after 100 years. So right now it's 2019. We're waiting for the adventure of the three Garadebs to go into public domain next January 2020, so we can publish our chapter book. Okay? So, okay. So, here we go. You want to take a quiz? Yes, ma'am.
Are they still going to have Sherlock Holmes Adventures on TV?
Well, you know, it's been a recurring thing. There's rumors of a 5th season for Benedict Cumberbatch, but it's not likely. Elementary just ended, okay? But I'm sure something will come along soon. In the meantime, you can go and grab the old videos and away you go. I went to BJ's a couple of months ago and they had all the Rathbone things on DVD. So, away we go. Okay, who wants to participate in a little quiz? We only have we got to be out of here in 10 minutes. So, nobody wants to participate? Okay, if you want to participate, stand up, please. Stand up. Okay, I'm just going to throw these questions out here. Okay, what was Holmes's full name? Was it William Scott Sherlock Holmes or William Sherlock Scott Holmes? Was it? What was his stage name? Okay, so yes, William Sherlock Scott Holmes, B. There we go. What was the duo's busiest year? There we go. What was ACD's favorite Sherlock Holmes story?
The Speckled Man.
Bingo. What was ACD's favorite character? Challenger. Where did Holmes keep his pipe and tobacco at 221B? Coal scuttle or Persian slipper? Persian slipper. What was Holmes's father's first name? Sager or Sharonford? Dad, yeah, the da, right. Sager, absolutely right. Where did Watson spend his boyhood? Australia or United States? There we go. Who portrayed Holmes on stage first? William Gillette or Basil Rathbone? Gillette. What was Holmes's favorite section of the newspapers? Crime news or agony columns? Actually, it was the agony columns. We call them the personals here in the United States. But he said, that's where you really find what's going on. Yeah. What was Mycroft Holmes's silent club? I'm not sure if I mentioned that. Diogenes or Montpelier? Diogenes. That's all, folks. Thank you very much.